The metal teeth of the handcuffs bit into his skin, a sharp, cold sting that cut through the humid air of the subway entrance. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Blue light flickered rhythmically against the concrete walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around him. He tried to turn, to ask what was happening, but a firm hand pressed against his shoulder, forcing him toward the open door of the cruiser. The city sounds, the distant hum of traffic and the relentless patter of rain seemed to mute, replaced by the frantic thud of his own pulse. He looked back at the subway stairs, the place where he had spent months playing for strangers, now a crime scene. The officers did not answer his questions. They pushed him into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a heavy final thud that echoed into the night. He sat in the dark, the cold plastic of the seat pressing against him, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of neon as the car pulled away. The dream he had chased across oceans had vanished, replaced by the sterile, suffocating reality. Months earlier, the air had felt different. Kofi had stepped off the plane at Incheon with nothing but a battered guitar case and a head full of melodies. He had left Ghana with a singular purpose: to turn his rhythm into a life. The streets of Seoul were wide, bright, and indifferent. He spent his first weeks navigating the labyrinth of the subway, finding corners where the acoustics amplified the soul of his music. He played for hours, his fingers calloused, his voice carrying the heat of his home into the freezing subterranean tunnels. At first, the coins in his case felt like progress. He slept in cramped, windowless rooms, waking before dawn to find a new spot to perform. Every note was a gamble, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between a stranger in a foreign city and the audience he needed to reach. But the city did not offer a hand. It demanded a toll. The hope that had fueled his flight began to fray under the weight of mounting rent. He had come here to share his sound, but he soon found himself fighting just to keep his instrument in his hands. The dream was still there, but it was buried. The trap had been set long before he arrived. To reach Seoul, Kofi had accepted an offer from a man who promised to cover his travel costs. It seemed like a lifeline at the time, a way to bypass the impossible hurdles of immigration and relocation. But the man was not a benefactor. He was a local mafia boss who viewed every person as an asset to be leveraged. Within weeks of his arrival, the debt was presented to him, inflated by hidden fees and interest that multiplied overnight. Kofi tried to pay. He emptied his guitar case every night, handing over every coin he earned to the enforcers who waited in the shadows of the station. It was never enough. The boss did not want his money. He wanted his compliance. He forced Kofi to perform in specific locations, monitoring his movements and dictating his schedule. The music that was meant to be his voice became his tether. He was trapped in a cycle of debt that kept him tethered to the subway tunnels, working for a master who held his passport and his future in a vice grip. Every melody he played was now a payment toward a debt that refused to shrink. The subway station was a concrete throat, swallowing thousands of commuters every hour. The air smelled of ozone, damp stone, and the stale exhaust of the city. Kofi stood in his usual corner, his fingers moving across the strings with a rhythmic, aching precision. He played a melody that felt like a memory of home, a sound that usually vanished into the roar of the incoming trains. Most people walked past without a glance. Then, the flow of the crowd stuttered. A woman stepped out of the rushing stream of commuters and stopped dead. She stood motionless, her gaze locked on the musician. The world around them seemed to tilt. She did not check her watch or adjust her pace. She simply stood in the middle of the platform, letting the people push past her. The melody cut through the screech of the tracks. She leaned in, her posture shifting from professional rigidity to something softer, more vulnerable. For the first time in months, Kofi looked up. The noise of the station faded into the background, leaving only the vibration of the strings. In that narrow space, the indifference of the city finally broke. Minji did not move until the final chord echoed into the tunnel walls. She reached into her bag, pulled out a stack of bills, and placed them gently into the open guitar case. She did not say a word. She simply nodded, a brief, sharp movement of recognition. Before turning to walk toward the exit, Kofi watched her go, the weight of the money feeling heavier than the coins he usually collected. The next evening, she returned. This time, she carried a paper bag that smelled of warm rice and spiced vegetables. She set it down beside his feet, her movements deliberate and steady. Kofi looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. He saw no pity there, only a quiet, insistent curiosity. He reached for the bag, his fingers brushing the warm paper, and she offered a faint, fleeting smile before disappearing into the evening rush. This became their rhythm. Every day, the city roared around them, but in that corner of the platform, a silent pact took root. She brought sustenance. He brought the melody that seemed to anchor her to the station. The routine shifted on a Tuesday. Minji arrived earlier than usual, but she did not bring food. She stood before him, her hands tucked into her pockets, watching him play the final notes of his set. As the last vibration died away, she pulled a small, heavy card from her bag and held it out. It was embossed with the logo of a major recording studio. She pointed toward the address, her finger tapping the paper with rhythmic insistence. Kofi stared at the card, then back at her. He looked at the grimy subway walls that had become his only stage, then at the promise of a real microphone and soundproof glass. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the guitar strings. He looked at the card again, then met Minji's gaze. She did not blink. She waited, her expression unreadable but expectant. Kofi reached out, his fingers closing around the card. He stood up, slung his guitar over his shoulder, and took the first step away from the platform. The studio door clicked shut, muffling the city's chaotic hum. Inside, the air was sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive equipment. Kofi set his guitar down on a padded stand, his hands still trembling from the transition. Minji spoke to the engineer, her voice crisp and authoritative. While Kofi adjusted the microphone stand, he did not notice the black sedan idling across the street. Inside the vehicle, a man leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the studio's glass facade. He held a pair of binoculars, tracking every movement Kofi made. To the enforcer, the studio was not a place of creation, it was a ledger. He tapped a rhythm on the steering wheel, his gaze cold and calculating. He watched Minji hand Kofi a water bottle, noting the way she leaned in close to hear him speak. The enforcer smirked, pulling a radio from his jacket. He didn't care about the melody or the lyrics. He saw a debt that had been ignored for too long, and a leverage point that was finally becoming visible. He spoke into the radio, his voice a low rasp that cut through the silence. The trap was no longer a theory. It was a plan in motion. The studio sessions bled into late-night walks through the neon-drenched alleys. Kofi and Minji moved through the crowds, the city's cold indifference pressing against them from every side. They found a rusted fire escape leading to a rooftop, a patch of concrete hidden from the streetlights. Here, the roar of traffic faded to a dull, rhythmic hum. Kofi sat on the edge, his fingers tracing the worn wood of his guitar. He played a soft, slow melody that didn't belong to the station or the studio. It was a sound for them. Minji sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline. She didn't speak, she simply listened, her posture relaxing. A police siren wailed nearby, and they both instinctively pulled back into the shadows, waiting for the blue light to sweep past. In that silence, their hands brushed. It was a brief, electric contact that held more weight than any conversation. Back in the dim office, the mafia boss stared at the photos scattered across his mahogany desk. Each image showed the same thing: Minji leaning toward the musician, her focus entirely on his presence. The boss crushed his cigar into an ashtray, the embers dying in a gray smear. He did not believe in coincidences, and he certainly did not believe in spontaneous human connection. He stood up and paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long against the wall. He picked up a picture of them together and tore it down the middle, separating the two figures with a sharp, jagged motion. He turned to his lieutenant, his voice dropping to a gravelly, calculated tone. "She is not falling for a man," he spat, gesturing toward the door. "She is being bewitched." He began to weave a narrative, a cold, calculated lie designed to strip away Minji's autonomy. He claimed the musician was using ancient, dark rituals to cloud her judgment and steal her loyalty. It was a convenient fiction, a way to paint the musician as a predator and Minji as a victim in need of rescue. The boss leaned over the desk, his eyes hard and unblinking. He ordered his men to spread the word. The trap was set, and the lie was ready to be unleashed. The plan moved with surgical precision. While Kofi practiced in the studio, the mafia's men bypassed the security locks, slipping into the office where he kept his records. They didn't steal equipment. They planted digital ghosts. They uploaded a series of forged bank transfers and doctored emails to his laptop, creating a paper trail that pointed directly to a systematic extortion scheme. Every transaction was designed to look like a shakedown of Minji's personal accounts. The next morning, the studio door didn't open for a session. It was kicked inward by plainclothes officers. Kofi stood by the microphone, his hand still resting on the guitar neck, as they swarmed the small room. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but they shoved him against the wall, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. One officer held up a tablet, displaying the fabricated evidence, the fake demands for money, the staged threats. Kofi looked at the screen, seeing his own name attached to crimes he had never imagined. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the officers read him his rights. He looked toward the door, hoping to see Minji, but there was only the blank, indifferent stare of the detectives. The interrogation room was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of a fluorescent light overhead. Kofi stared at the gray concrete floor, his hands still raw from the cuffs. He closed his eyes, and the sterile smell of the station faded. Instead, he smelled the damp, metallic air of the Seoul subway terminal. He could hear the echo of his own guitar strings bouncing off the tiled walls, a sound that used to fill the space with warmth. He remembered the way the crowd moved, a blur of hurried footsteps and averted gazes until the melody made them stop. He recalled the specific weight of his guitar against his chest, the vibration of the wood, and the way the station's cold indifference had slowly thawed under the music. He saw the platform lights reflecting in the puddles, the vibrant energy of a city that had once felt like a promise. Then, a heavy metal door slammed in the hallway, shattering the memory. The cold returned. He opened his eyes to the peeling paint of the interrogation room and the stark, unforgiving reality of the bars. The music was gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of the accusation. He sat motionless, the phantom resonance of his guitar still lingering in his fingers, while the reality of his isolation pressed in from every side. In the glass-walled boardroom, the atmosphere was brittle. Minji sat at the head of the table, her fingers tracing the edge of a tablet screen. Her advisors stood behind her, their faces masks of professional concern. They tapped the glass, cycling through the fabricated bank records and the doctored emails. Minji looked at the numbers, then at the timestamps, trying to find a flaw, a reason to doubt the screen. She remembered the melody in the subway, but the data on the table was precise, cold, and damning. When she opened her mouth to speak, the lead advisor leaned forward. He placed a folder on the table, detailing the potential fallout for her company. The threat was clear. Her reputation, her career, everything was on the line. Minji looked at the documents one last time. She stood up, her movements stiff, and walked to the window overlooking the city lights. She didn't speak. She didn't fight. She simply nodded, signaling her agreement to distance herself. The board members filed out. She reached for her phone, hovered her thumb over Kofi's contact, and then, with a sharp, decisive motion, she locked the screen. The cell was a concrete box, stripped of everything but the damp chill that seeped through the walls. Kofi sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the single, flickering light bulb. The silence was heavy, designed to break him, to make the hours bleed into one another until he lost his sense of self. He shifted, his shoulders aching from the cold, and drew a long, steady breath. He needed a tether. He began to hum. It started as a low, barely audible vibration in his chest, a single note that mimicked the opening chord of the song he had written for Minji. The sound caught in the small space, bouncing off the hard surfaces, creating a fragile resonance. Outside, the heavy boots of a guard paced the corridor. Kofi didn't stop. He pushed the melody harder, letting the notes climb, weaving the structure of the song into the stagnant air. He closed his eyes, visualizing the subway station. The guard stopped outside his door for a moment, then moved on. Kofi kept playing. Minji remained at her desk, the screen still dark. The office door opened without a knock. A man stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not wait for an invitation. He walked to the center of the office, his boots clicking sharply. He stopped at the edge of her desk and placed a single, heavy hand on the wood. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and the air in the room grew thin. He spoke in a low, steady tone. He listed the locations of her family members, naming the schools they attended and the routes they took home. He mentioned the specific contracts her company was currently negotiating, detailing the exact points where they could be sabotaged. He told her that her support for the musician was a liability. If she made one more move, the consequences would be permanent. He turned and walked toward the door. Minji sat in the silence, her breath shallow, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Minji waited until the office was empty before she reached for her private phone. She dialed a number she had kept hidden for years. She didn't speak to the police. She spoke to a man who operated in the shadows of the city's legal system. She met him in a crowded, noisy terminal where no one would notice a brief exchange. She handed over a thick envelope containing every record. She instructed him to trace the extortion claims back to their source, regardless of the cost. The investigator looked at the documents, then at her, warning her that digging this deep would invite scrutiny from the board. She nodded, accepting the risk. She returned to her office and began shredding. Every strip of paper that fell into the bin was a gamble against her career. She knew the mafia was watching her digital footprint, so she used an encrypted drive to store the evidence she gathered. By the time the sun began to rise, she had dismantled her safeguards. She sat back, watching the city wake up, knowing she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. The investigation was underway. Kofi sat on the edge of the metal bench, his hands pressed against his knees. The walls of the cell were bare, painted in a dull, peeling gray that seemed to absorb the light. Outside the heavy door, the sounds of the station were muffled, a constant, rhythmic thud of boots and the sharp, unintelligible bark of orders. He tried to piece together the words he had learned, but his mind felt like a tangled web. When a guard passed by, Kofi stood and reached for the bars, his voice cracking as he tried to explain the situation. The guard didn't even slow his pace. He just tapped his baton against the metal frame and kept walking. Kofi sank back onto the bench, the cold metal seeping through his skin. He stared at the floor, watching a single drop of water fall. The silence of the cell grew heavy, pressing against his chest until every breath felt like a struggle. Minji's screen flickered to life as the encrypted file finished downloading. She pulled the keyboard closer, her fingers moving with a frantic rhythm. The investigator had sent a list of registration numbers for the travel agency that had facilitated the musician's arrival. She opened the government database, her eyes scanning the rows of corporate filings. She typed in the agency's tax identification number. The system returned a blank page. She tried again, this time searching for the parent company listed in the fine print of the original contract. The results loaded slowly. She traced the ownership history back through 3 layers of holding companies, each one more obscure than the last. Her pulse quickened as she hit the final entry. The registered address for the parent company was the same industrial complex where the local crime syndicate operated their illicit gambling dens. She sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. It was not a travel agency at all. It was a mechanism for human trafficking, designed to lure people into debt. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor, and reached for her coat. The trap was clear, and she knew exactly where the strings were pulled. Minji pulled the physical ledger from the bottom of the evidence box. The pages were brittle, yellowed at the edges. She flipped past the initial travel costs and landed on the section marked service fees. Her eyes widened. The mafia had applied a daily compounding interest rate that defied standard banking logic. She grabbed a calculator, her thumb tapping the keys with aggressive precision. Every day he spent in the city, his debt grew by an amount that eclipsed his earnings from a month of street performances. She scrolled to the final page of the contract. There was a clause buried in the fine print that allowed the syndicate to seize any future assets, including intellectual property. They did not want the money back. They wanted his music, his time, and his identity. She traced the ink with her finger, the reality of the scheme settling into her bones. It was a cycle designed to reset every time he made a payment, ensuring the balance never dropped below the threshold of total control. He was not a debtor. He was an asset being harvested. She slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing in the quiet office. The math was cold, calculated, and absolute. There was no way out through legal channels. Minji walked into the holding facility, her movements stiff and deliberate. The air inside smelled of bleach and stagnant sweat. She approached the registration desk, where a clerk with tired eyes stared at a flickering monitor. She did not speak. She slid a thick envelope across the counter, her hand trembling just enough to be noticed. The clerk glanced at the security camera, then swept the envelope into a drawer. He nodded once, signaling the guard at the heavy steel door. Minji was led down a narrow, windowless corridor to the interrogation room. Kofi sat at the metal table, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. When the guard turned to check the hallway, Minji stepped forward. She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Kofi's palm. Her fingers brushed his, a brief, grounding contact that made him look up. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and searching. She gave a single, sharp nod. As the guard returned, she pulled back, smoothing her features into a neutral facade. Kofi gripped the paper, his knuckles turning white. The enforcer did not take the news of Minji's visit lightly. He paced the subway platform, his heavy boots echoing against the tiles, his face twisted in a sneer of pure spite. He knew exactly where Kofi kept his gear. He marched toward the storage alcove behind the ticket booth, kicking aside a stack of discarded newspapers. With a sharp tug, he ripped the padlock from the locker door. Inside, he found the second guitar, the one Kofi had saved for months to purchase. The enforcer pulled it out by the neck, his fingers digging into the wood. He did not hesitate. He raised the instrument high and brought it down against the edge of a concrete pillar. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the station like a gunshot. Strings snapped, whipping through the air. He didn't stop there. He dumped the contents of the locker onto the grime-covered floor. Songbooks, capos, spare picks, and a small notebook filled with lyrics. He ground his heel into the pages, tearing them into confetti. He swept the remaining debris into the path of an oncoming train, watching as the wind from the tunnel sucked the remnants of Kofi's life into the darkness. The alcove was empty. The music was gone. The enforcer stood in the silence, satisfied that he had stripped the musician of his only remaining voice. The interrogation room door slammed shut, the heavy bolt sliding into place with a final metallic thud. Two detectives sat across from Kofi, their faces obscured by the glare of a single harsh overhead light. One of them tossed a thick file onto the metal table, the sound echoing like a gavel. He leaned forward, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. He didn't ask about the alleged extortion. Instead, he pulled out a grainy photograph of Minji and tapped it with a rhythmic, mocking finger. He started to laugh, a dry, grating sound that filled the small space. He spoke of ancient spirits and dark rituals, framing Kofi's music as a tool for bewitching the CEO. He leaned in until his breath hit Kofi's face, demanding to know what incantations were used to cloud her judgment. Kofi stared back, his jaw tight. The detective stood up and paced the small perimeter, his shadow looming large against the peeling paint of the walls. He slammed his palms onto the table. Kofi felt the walls closing in, the air growing thick, but he held his ground, refusing to sign the papers that would turn his life into a lie. Minji returned to her office, the silence of the high-rise floor pressing against her ears. She dropped her bag on the desk, intending to call her legal team, but a plain brown envelope sat waiting in the center of her blotter. She tore it open, expecting more corporate paperwork, but her breath hitched as she pulled out a single photograph. It showed her parents sitting on their porch in Busan, taken from a distance. A second photo followed, showing the front door marked with a jagged, red X. Her hands trembled, the paper crinkling in her grip. She reached for her phone, dialing her father's number with frantic, uneven taps. The line rang once, twice, then clicked into a hollow, static-filled silence. She tried again, but the connection failed immediately. A text message pinged on her screen. A single line of text from an unknown sender. "The next one will not be a photo." She stood frozen, the city lights blurring into streaks of cold neon. Every move she made to help Kofi now carried the weight of her parents' lives. Kofi sat on the cold bench, his back against the damp concrete wall. The interrogation had ended, but the threat remained, hanging in the air like smoke. He watched the hallway through the iron bars. A guard walked past, stopping briefly to accept a thick envelope from a man in a dark sedan parked just outside. The exchange was quick, practiced, and devoid of shame. Kofi realized then that the law was not a shield. It was a weapon the mafia already held. His initial shock began to crystallize into a cold, hard focus. He thought of Minji, of the way she had looked at him in the subway, and of the danger she was now walking into because of him. He could not wait for a lawyer who would never arrive or a judge who was already bought. He stood up, pacing the small cell, his movements deliberate and measured. He needed to reach her before the enforcers did. He pressed his hand against the cold steel of the cell door, feeling the vibration of the city outside. He would not let her be the one to pay for his dream. The silence of the cell was no longer a cage. It was a space to plan. He began to map out the layout of the station, searching for a gap. Minji pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct, her briefcase heavy with affidavits and notarized statements. She walked straight to the front desk, her pace steady despite the tremor in her hands. She laid the documents out, one by one, demanding to see the captain. The sergeant behind the counter did not even glance at the signatures. He reached out, pulled the stack toward him, and fed the pages into a shredder mounted on the corner of his desk. The machine whirred, spitting out ribbons of white paper into a plastic bin. Minji lunged forward, her hand catching the edge of the desk, but the sergeant leaned back, his expression flat and bored. He tapped a badge on his chest, then pointed toward the exit. She tried to argue, citing the law, but he simply picked up his phone and dialed a number, watching her with cold, dead eyes. She turned to her lawyer, but the man had already stepped back, refusing to meet her gaze. The precinct was not a place of justice. It was a fortress. She stood in the center of the lobby, the sound of the shredder still echoing. She realized then that the system was actively working to keep Kofi buried. Kofi kept his eyes on the narrow slit of the cell door. The hallway lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the floor. He heard the heavy thud of boots, but the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too deliberate. The guard usually walked with a hurried, indifferent gait. This sound was heavy, measured, and carried the weight of someone who owned the space. Kofi stood, his muscles coiled, ready to move. The lock clicked, but it was not the sharp metallic snap of a key. It was a slow, grinding sound that echoed through the entire block. The door swung inward, scraping against the concrete. A man stepped into the threshold, blocking the dim light from the hallway. He did not wear a uniform. He wore a heavy, dark coat that seemed to absorb the flickering light. He stepped fully into the cell, his boots crunching on the grit of the floor. He reached back and pulled the heavy steel door shut. The lock engaged with a final, definitive thud that vibrated through the walls. The air in the room grew heavy, stagnant. Kofi stood his ground, watching the man move toward the center of the cell, leaving no exit behind him. The man stopped inches from Kofi, his shadow stretching across the wall. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He leaned forward, his face coming so close that Kofi could feel the cold, rhythmic pulse of his breath against his ear. The man reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the metal table with a slow, deliberate scrape that set Kofi's teeth on edge. He tapped the surface twice, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the stagnant air. Then, the whisper came, a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in Kofi's chest. "She is not just a client to you, is she?" The man paused, letting the question hang in the air like a physical weight. He shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the floor, and leaned in further. "If you continue the music, If you keep this connection alive, she will pay the price for your arrogance." He pulled back just enough. The man straightened, his posture rigid, and stepped toward the door. He simply waited for the lock to release, leaving Kofi standing in the sudden, ringing silence. The lobby of the station was a blur of fluorescent light and shouting voices. Minji pushed through the glass doors, her pace rapid, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto the sergeant at the front desk. She did not wait for an invitation. She crossed the floor in long, purposeful strides, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. When the officer moved to block her path, she slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the counter. The sound echoed like a gunshot. She spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am here for the detainee in room 4. Now, the sergeant reached for the papers, but she pulled them back, her grip tightening until her knuckles turned white. She leaned over the desk, forcing him to meet her gaze. She did not blink. She did not retreat. She demanded the logbook. Minji did not wait for his permission. She turned and walked toward the heavy steel door, her focus fixed entirely on the corridor. The heavy door swung open, revealing the narrow, sterile corridor. Minji stopped at the threshold of the final room. The air inside was cold, smelling of ozone and floor wax. She stepped forward, her boots silent on the concrete, and saw him. Kofi sat on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. Between them stood the reinforced glass partition, a thick, transparent wall that turned their world into a silent film. She reached out, pressing her palm against the cold surface. Kofi mirrored the movement, his fingers aligning with hers on the opposite side. There was no sound, only the sight of their faces, stripped of pretense. The chaos of the station outside faded into a dull, rhythmic hum. In that stillness, the depth of their situation became clear. Minji's jaw tightened as she scanned his face for signs of injury, her eyes searching his for a flicker of hope. Kofi held her gaze, his expression hardening as he remembered the enforcer's threat. He pulled his hand back, just an inch, then pressed it harder against the glass. The silence in the room held for a heartbeat longer. Then, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the quiet of the corridor. It was the steady tap of leather soles against the concrete floor. Minji's eyes flicked toward the door, her posture stiffening instantly. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. The enforcer did not rush. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his head tilted slightly as he watched them through the narrow observation window. He was a statue of patient malice. Every movement he made was calculated, a slow shift of weight that signaled he was in no hurry. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a lighter, and flicked it open. The small flame danced in the dark, illuminating his face for a fraction of a second. He was waiting. He knew they were trapped, and he was savoring the sight of their desperation. Kofi pulled his hand back from the glass. He began to walk forward, his pace measured, his eyes fixed on the room. The distance between them shrank with every step. The enforcer reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle, but the heavy steel lock clicked open before he could touch it. A desk sergeant stepped out, holding a stack of documents. He looked at Kofi, then at the enforcer, and gestured toward the exit. The release was processed in silence, the paperwork signed with a speed that felt wrong. Kofi stood, his joints stiff, and walked past the enforcer. The man did not move, but his eyes tracked Kofi's every step, a silent promise of what was to come. Kofi pushed through the outer doors and stepped into the night. Rain slicked the pavement, reflecting the neon signs of the city in fractured, distorted light. He walked toward the subway entrance, his ears straining for the sound of footsteps behind him. There were none. The street was empty, yet the air felt crowded with eyes. He stopped under a street lamp, the light buzzing overhead, and looked back at the station. The entrance was a dark maw, waiting. He realized then that the bail was not a mercy, it was a leash. They wanted him out in the open, where the shadows were deeper and the witnesses were few. Minji was waiting in the shadow of a pillar, her breath visible in the cooling night air. She did not speak as Kofi approached. She simply nodded toward the entrance of the parking garage. They stepped inside together, and the ambient roar of the city vanished, replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence. The concrete floor absorbed the sound of their footsteps, turning every stride into a rhythmic echo that seemed to bounce back from the darkness. Kofi kept his pace steady, though his muscles were coiled, ready to pivot at the slightest disturbance. The air here smelled of stale exhaust and damp earth. They moved deeper into the structure, passing rows of empty stalls that looked like gaping mouths in the dim light. Minji reached out, her fingers brushing Kofi's arm, a brief touch that signaled their shared fear. They stopped, the silence now so absolute that the sound of their own heartbeats seemed to fill the room. The silence shattered. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the concrete floor, growing in intensity until it felt like the entire structure was trembling. Kofi grabbed Minji's hand, pulling her back toward the nearest support pillar. But before they could find cover, the darkness at the far end of the row exploded. Two blinding white beams of light cut through the gloom, slicing across the dust-filled air and slamming into them with the force of a physical blow. The light was absolute, erasing the shadows and turning the garage into a stark, high-contrast nightmare. Kofi raised an arm to shield his eyes, the glare burning into his retinas, leaving him unable to see anything beyond the wall of white. The engine roared, a mechanical scream that echoed off the low ceiling, and the vehicle surged forward. Tires screeched against the slick concrete, the sound piercing and sharp. They were pinned against the cold, damp wall, the heat from the engine wash hitting them as the car skidded to a halt just inches away. The driver's door groaned open, the metal hinge protesting in the quiet. Kofi stood his ground, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. There was nowhere left to run. The enforcer stepped out, his boots clicking rhythmically on the concrete. He reached into his jacket, his hand tightening around a heavy object, his gaze locked on them with cold intent. Kofi did not reach for a weapon. Instead, he swung his guitar case around, unzipped the latch, and pulled the instrument into the light. The enforcer paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. Kofi struck the first chord, a sharp, resonant sound that vibrated through the stagnant garage air. He began to play the melody he had written for Minji, a haunting sequence of notes that seemed to push back the oppressive weight of the space. The enforcer hesitated, his hand hovering over his pocket, his posture losing its aggressive edge as the music filled the silence. He looked at the shadows, then back at the guitar, visibly unsettled by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Then, the distance was broken by a rising wail of sirens. Blue and red lights began to strobe against the concrete pillars, reflecting off the puddles on the floor. The enforcer spun around, his face twisting in panic, as the sound of heavy footsteps approached from the garage entrance. The mafia's grip on the room evaporated. Kofi kept playing, his fingers steady, as the police swarmed the area. The chaos subsided as quickly as it had begun. Handcuffs clicked, voices barked orders, and the enforcer was led toward the waiting patrol cars, his defiance replaced by a sullen silence. Kofi watched the blue lights fade as the officers cleared the garage, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and the damp chill of the concrete. He lowered his guitar, his fingers aching from the tension, and looked toward Minji. She stood a few feet away, her breathing finally evening out, the lines of stress around her eyes softening as the reality of their safety took hold. They did not speak. The weight of the last few months was too heavy for words. Instead, they walked together toward the exit ramp, their footsteps echoing in the now empty space. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city. They stepped onto the sidewalk, the neon signs of the district casting long, vibrant reflections on the wet asphalt. The threat that had loomed over them for so long was gone, dissolved by the simple act of standing their ground. Kofi felt the strap of his guitar against his shoulder, a reminder of the melody that had changed everything. They turned the corner, moving away from the shadows of the garage and into the steady, pulsing light of the street, finally free to choose their own path. The streets of Gangnam stretched out before them, a river of light and motion that felt entirely different than it had only hours ago. They walked past the glass-fronted shops, their reflections blurring against the displays. Every step felt lighter, the phantom weight of the debt finally stripped away. They reached the subway entrance, the very spot where the first melody had been played, and stopped. The stairs led down into the familiar subterranean hum, But the air here no longer felt cold or indifferent. It was just a place, a point of origin, no longer a trap. Kofi set his guitar case down for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the city, the distant sirens, the chatter of late-night commuters. Minji stood beside him, watching the flow of people, her posture relaxed. They had arrived here as strangers, but they were leaving as individuals who had reclaimed their own agency. The neon signs overhead pulsed in steady, rhythmic cycles, painting the sidewalk in shifting hues of pink and blue. They turned away from the station entrance and continued walking, moving deeper into the city, ready to build something that belonged only to them. The city skyline loomed ahead, a jagged edge of light against the dark sky. They reached the bridge, the metal railing cool under their palms as they leaned out to watch the water churn below. The river reflected the city lights, a shimmering tapestry of movement that mirrored the change within them. They had spent months fighting for the right to exist in this space, and now the struggle was replaced by the simple, steady rhythm of their own breathing. Kofi looked at the horizon, then back at the path they had traveled. The debt, the threats, and the fear were now distant memories. They pushed off from the railing and resumed their walk, their pace synchronized. The crowd thickened as they entered the main square. They moved through the throng, blending into the pulse of the metropolis. There was no looking back. The path ahead was unwritten. They walked until the city lights swallowed them whole, two figures moving toward a future they had finally earned. The urban noise began to fade as they reached the edge of a small, quiet park tucked between the high-rises. They stopped near a bench, the wood worn smooth by years of use. The air here was cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant rain. They sat down, the silence of the park a stark contrast to the relentless hum of the streets they had just left. For the first time in months, the tension in their shoulders dissolved. They watched the moonlight filter through the leaves, casting long, shifting shadows across the path. The weight of the past had been set down, and in its place was the quiet clarity of the present. They stood up and walked toward the park exit, where the city lights waited like a promise. They reached the gate and stepped out onto the sidewalk, moving with purpose toward the horizon. The path ahead was wide and open, no longer dictated by debts or threats. They walked side by side, their footsteps falling in unison against the pavement. The city stretched out before them, a vast, unwritten space. They moved forward, leaving the struggle behind, ready to define their own rhythm. The first light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, softening the harsh edges of the concrete towers. They reached the final intersection, where the road split into a dozen different directions. They stopped, the silence of the early morning wrapping around them. There were no more shadows to hide in, no more debts to account for, and no more threats to navigate. They looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement of the distance they had covered. The air was crisp, carrying the promise of a day that belonged to no one but themselves. They took a breath, the cold morning air filling their lungs, and stepped off the curb. They walked across the intersection, their pace steady and unhurried. The city began to wake up around them, the hum of traffic rising in the distance. But they didn't look back. They moved toward the rising sun, the light catching the pavement ahead. Every step was a deliberate choice, a reclamation of the rhythm they had fought so hard to protect. They walked until the buildings thinned and the horizon opened wide. The struggle was over. The path was theirs to forge, and they moved forward into the morning, leaving the past to dissolve in the growing light. The city eventually gave way to the open expanse of the harbor. They walked along the concrete pier, the rhythmic slap of water against the pilings providing a steady pulse. The smell of salt and cold iron filled the air. They stopped at the very edge, watching the dark water churn and pull away from the shore. This was the boundary. Beyond this point, the influence of the past could not reach them. They stood in the stillness, the wind pulling at their shoulders, and watched the tide retreat into the deep. There was no need for words. The resolution was written in the way they stood, grounded and unmoving. After a long moment, they turned away from the water, their movements synchronized and calm. They walked back toward the city, not as fugitives, but as residents of a world they had reclaimed. The lights of the skyline flickered, no longer intimidating, but welcoming. They merged into the flow of the waking city, their figures becoming part of the landscape. The journey had ended, but the life they had fought for was just beginning. They stepped forward, leaving the pier behind, and disappeared into the morning, finally free to write their own future. They found a small, elevated park overlooking the sprawling grid of the city. The morning sun was now fully risen, casting long shadows across the pathways. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, watching the traffic flow like a river below. The noise of the city was a distant hum, no longer a source of tension, but a backdrop to their quiet victory. They sat for a long time, hands resting on their knees, simply breathing in the stillness. Kofi reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn guitar pick, placing it on the bench between them. It was a final, silent marker of the melody that had changed everything. They stood up together, moving with a synchronized ease. They walked toward the park exit, their footsteps echoing on the paved path. They did not look back at the bench or the city below. The horizon stretched out before them, clear and wide. They reached the gate and continued walking until their figures merged into the light. The streets widened as they moved away from the park, the concrete giving way to a bustling thoroughfare. They walked side by side, their pace steady and unhurried. The city around them moved with its usual frantic energy, but they remained anchored in their own rhythm. They stopped before a large glass storefront, pausing to look at their own reflections in the pane. The figures staring back were no longer the people who had arrived in this city years ago. They were changed, tempered by the conflict they had survived. Kofi adjusted his grip on his instrument case, feeling the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a tool of his own making. Minji stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon rather than the glass. They shared a brief, silent nod, an acknowledgement of the distance they had traveled together. They turned away from the reflection and continued down the sidewalk, their footsteps falling in perfect unison. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of coffee and urban life. They crossed the intersection, moving into the heart of the district, and disappeared into the crowd. The city swallowed them, not as victims, but as architects of their own lives. The transit hub loomed ahead, a massive structure of steel and glass vibrating with the pulse of departures. They climbed the final set of stairs, the metal grating ringing under their boots. At the top, they paused. The city lay behind them, a sprawling map of the struggles they had finally outlasted. Kofi looked at the terminal clock, the numbers ticking forward with a steady, mechanical precision. He shifted his weight. Minji reached out, her fingers brushing the cold railing as she took one last breath of the city air. They turned toward the gate, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft hiss. A rush of wind from the platform greeted them. They stepped onto the carriage, the doors closing behind them with a final, definitive click. The train began to move, accelerating away from the platform, carrying them into the quiet distance. The train gathered speed, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks replacing the static hum of the city. Outside the window, the dense forest of skyscrapers thinned, replaced by the rolling green of the countryside. Kofi leaned his head against the glass, watching the last of the urban sprawl dissolve into the horizon. Minji sat beside him, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her breathing steady and deep. The tension that had defined their existence for so long had finally drained away, leaving behind a profound, quiet clarity. They watched the landscape shift, the harsh edges of the city giving way to soft, natural light. There was no need for words. The silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets or fear, but light with the potential of the unknown. The train banked into a long curve, and for a fleeting second, the entire city was visible in the distance, a small, flickering cluster of lights against the darkening sky. Then, the train entered a tunnel, and the view vanished. When they emerged on the other side, the world was open, vast, and entirely new. The train slowed, the screech of metal on metal fading into a low, rhythmic vibration before the carriage came to a complete halt. Outside, the platform was empty, bathed in the soft, diffused light of early morning. Kofi stood up, his movements fluid and unburdened. He reached for the door handle, pushed it down, and stepped out onto the concrete. The air here was crisp, smelling of damp earth and distant pine. Minji followed him, her boots clicking against the station floor. They walked toward the exit, their shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. Near the turnstiles, they paused one last time. Kofi looked at his guitar case, then at the horizon, and set the instrument down for a moment to stretch his arms wide. The weight of the past had vanished, replaced by the simple, physical reality of the present. They pushed through the heavy exit doors, stepping out into a wide, quiet street that led toward the hills. Just the steady sound of their own footsteps on the pavement. The road ahead stretched toward the hills, a narrow ribbon of asphalt winding through fields of tall, swaying grass. Kofi and Minji walked in rhythm, their boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. The city was now a memory, a distant hum. They stopped near a wooden fence to catch their breath, the air cool and sharp in their lungs. Kofi looked at his hands, steady and relaxed, then reached out to touch the rough grain of the fence post. Minji stood beside him, watching a hawk circle high above the valley, her posture loose and unhurried. They listened to the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. A sense of permanence settled over them. They turned away from the fence and resumed their walk, side by side, moving toward the rising sun. The path was clear, and for the first time, they disappeared into the golden light of the morning. The path climbed steadily, leading them to a rocky ridge that overlooked the entire valley. Kofi stopped, his boots finding purchase on the uneven stone. Below, the world they had escaped was nothing more than a faint gray smudge on the horizon, barely visible under the morning haze. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the old, frayed performance permit he had carried for years, and let the wind catch it. It fluttered away, tumbling down the slope until it vanished into the brush. Minji stepped up beside him, her hand finding his. She squeezed his fingers, her grip firm and grounded. They stood there for a long moment, watching the sun clear the peaks, bathing the landscape in a warm, steady glow. The tension that had lived in their shoulders for months finally dissolved, replaced by the simple rhythm of their breathing. They turned their backs on the valley, leaving the last echoes of the city behind. Side by side, they walked over the crest of the ridge. The meadow opened up before them, a vast expanse of wildflowers swaying in the gentle morning breeze. Kofi stopped in the center of the field, the grass reaching his knees. He unslung the guitar case from his back, the latches clicking with a sound that felt final. He sat on a flat, sun-warmed stone and pulled the instrument out. His fingers moved across the strings, finding a melody that was light, unhurried, and entirely his own. Minji sat beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder, her eyes closed as she absorbed the sound. The music drifted across the valley, carrying no weight of debt or fear, only the clarity of the present moment. He played until the last vibration faded into the stillness of the meadow. He packed the guitar away, stood up, and took Minji's hand. They walked toward the edge of the woods where the sunlight broke through the canopy in thick golden shafts. Every step was deliberate, unburdened by the past. They kept walking, side by side. If you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.